We continue in our study of the minor prophets, and we are just about done with Zechariah. Maybe not to my satisfaction or your satisfaction, and truth be known, but about as good as I can do with it. It just, I tried again this afternoon to just kind of absorb it again and reevaluate it again, and I probably am more confused now than I was when I was confused at first. It's challenging, and I guess if you can kind of settle on what you believe the prophet is pointing to, then maybe that kind of can satisfy you a little bit, in the sense that if we kind of pick a time period, I still contend that phrase that's repeatedly used, in that day, in that day, in that day, in that day, most likely points to the time of Jesus. There's too many clear kind of connections to Jesus within these narratives that kind of helps point us in that direction. Although some of the things that he says that are going to happen in that day don't necessarily match up to what we think of as it relates to things that occur at the arrival of Jesus upon the scene. And so this text has challenged me in ways that probably no other has, in some ways, in trying to define it and understand it. I think ultimately, the point I believe the prophet is driving at is the fact that everybody's ultimately going to be subject to whom? Christ, who is in reference to the kingdom, is the king. And so there are moments in the narrative where he challenges the Israelite folks to recognize that there's something great on the horizon coming, and God's preserving them, not just to save them as a nation, but to fulfill the promise that He'd made to Abraham, that ultimately his seed would come, and it's not time for that yet. Daniel prophesies roughly in this time period, a little bit earlier than this, but roughly in this time period, about the various kingdoms that would come and go before Jesus would arrive, the great king. And so you can see some of that in what Zechariah speaks of. And so, as we stated Sunday, as we look through some of this, it's certainly a challenging text to try to pick up on. So let's start here about verse 16 as we kind of wrap up this chapter, and then allow you, if you've got something better than what I've shared, we'll hear that, and then we'll move on into Malachi this evening. But notice he says, it'll come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of tabernacles. Now again, here's why I'm challenged with this. Because which king is he talking about? Well, he kind of says, right? He says the King, and then what's the next phrase? The Lord of hosts. Okay, so that kind of narrows it down. This isn't any old king. This isn't a ruler among men. This king, he defines here as the King who is the Lord of hosts. He's the one they're going to be coming to worship. He's the one that they're obligated to. But what the challenge I have is that then he says, and to keep what? Feast of the Tabernacles. Now, why would that be challenging? That's right. That went away. That went away with the coming of Jesus and Him nailing that Old Testament authoritative message to the cross. And those Old Testament feasts no longer had their validity any longer, if you will. And in fact, there are plenty of New Testament narratives that very clearly teach us that it was time for them to move beyond the feast days and the holy days that they had become so accustomed in honoring, and to respect the fact that the new covenant in Jesus had changed that picture. Now, I suppose you could argue that when he says to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, that's a direct reflection not on Jesus, but on God. And if that be the case, then I suppose you could make a contemporary argument in their day that the reestablishment of temple worship there in Jerusalem was going to allow for Jerusalem to become the central focus again of religious practice and worship towards Jehovah God, and that He would be summoning, if you will, or calling upon anyone who wants to honor Him to be focused upon Jerusalem. And so maybe there's a connection in relationship to that. The challenge is that we don't have any biblical history to be able to tie to those kinds of events in terms of their happening. Because once we get through Malachi, we're silent for the next 400 years. And so again, either one of those I can understand, and both of them create their own set of maybe challenges and difficulties to try to work through. When I get into texts like this, we kind of talk about this a little bit on Sunday. Sometimes we can maybe just step back and appreciate that somebody very specifically in mind as it relates to this narrative probably would have understood this clearer than we. And if Zechariah has his modern day audience in mind when he pens these things, then maybe they would click in their minds much more quickly than ours would as it relates to that. I mean, notice the continued same kind of language. If the family of Egypt go not up, and come not, and have no rain, there shall be the plague, wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the feast of tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the feast of tabernacles. Now, I'm willing to accept the fact that maybe this Feast of Tabernacles is just being used in terms of reference to the feast that Jesus is going to offer, because ultimately He's the one that's calling how many nations to come to Him? All of them. And if they want blessing and benefit, the only source for that is going to be to come to Jesus. And where's His message going to pour forth from? Jerusalem. And so I can see it. I just don't know how to iron it all out for you in my own mind to even make it any more clear in yours as it relates to what kind of time period is he addressing. Again, the phrase, in that day shall there be upon the bells of the horses holiness unto the Lord, and the pots in the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. And yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts, and all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seethe therein. And in that day there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. And so again, yeah. And so to me, as a picture form of what's happening with Jesus, I can grasp this easier. Because His kingdom isn't invaded or overwhelmed by any other nation. His kingdom lets anyone come, but they have to come as His disciples in order to embrace the benefits of those things. The challenge I have to put it in a contemporary mindset is, what kind of sacrifices does Malachi say they're offering? If you read ahead. Right? Contemptible and polluted. They had polluted the altars of God by the time Malachi starts speaking, who's a relative contemporary to Zechariah. And so if this is a reference to somehow the purity of worship and sacrifice that comes out of Jerusalem, it seems like it doesn't come in the moment that they're in, because Malachi speaks about their sacrifices and things being offered unto God as the exact opposite of that. And so again, that's why I struggle trying to frame any of these things that he's talking about as happening in the moment that they're occurring in Zechariah's writing. I still feel like these are pictures of this new kingdom and the new covenant and the new promise, or the fulfilled promises that can be found in Jesus. But every time I feel like I've got a clear path in my own mind, something else in the text jumps out and says, well, that doesn't fit. And so it's, there's nothing wrong sometimes with saying, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd rather say that than tell you this is exactly what it is, and be wrong. Go ahead, Randy. Yeah. Right. And there could be some implication to the temple and temple worship as it relates to that, but it also has direct impact upon the way the kingdom of Jesus is going to look like. And Canaanite may represent all things that are heathen and foreign to the principles and teachings of Jesus. It can't be part of the kingdom. Um, I can see that there. Yeah, he could have some. Right, he could be making a spiritual context of yeah, and again, I'm perfectly accepting of the idea that when he uses the phrase Feast of Tabernacles in Zechariah's words, he's not necessarily referring to their feast and holy day, but the feast that's coming as it relates to the spiritual bread that Jesus is going to offer. I still feel like that phrase "in that day, in that day, in that day, in that day" has to point to the same time period. And if we can clearly see that kind of points to Jesus in more clearly defined verses, then I'm willing to accept the idea that that's the point of Zechariah. He's pointing us to those events. Yeah, I don't know that we'd be able to evidence. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't understand history enough. But I don't know that we'd be able to evidence this physically. All of these things happening physically as it relates to the nation, the temple in Jerusalem, and all those things. Again, I could be wrong on that. May not fully grasp all the history.
And I'm going to butcher some of these names. In Isaiah chapter 60, he prophesies a lot about this. If I can just read a little bit of
Sure,
it.
sure.
Isaiah 60. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and the gross darkness the people. But the Lord shall arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. And the Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. Lift up thine eyes round about, and see how they gather themselves together. They come to thee. Thy son shall come from afar, thy daughter shall be nursed at thy side. Then shalt see and flow together, and thine heart shall fear and be enlarged, because the abundance of the sea shall be covered unto thee. The horses of the Gentiles shall come unto thee. Then I'm just going to skip a little bit here, but it talks about in verse 6, the multitudes of the camels shall cover thee, the dromedaries of Midian Ephah, all they from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and incense, and they shall show forth the praises of the Lord. That's the same thing.
Yeah. Only more clearly understood here. In Isaiah's words is what he's pointing to. Yeah. And I would agree. And I think that we can kind of make some of that connection to some of the things that Zechariah is saying. Any other thoughts? No brave ones out there, huh? All right. And sometimes we have to be willing to accept that we may not grasp all the details, but if we can see a picture of what the prophet's trying to point to and grasp it maybe from the other narratives that he speaks about, it can help simplify some of the challenging. But I certainly wouldn't let the challenging overrule the simple, and I certainly wouldn't let the challenging diffuse as if all of a sudden it's not truth. There's all kinds of truths that I might not grasp in their fullness. Doesn't make them any less true. And just because I may not grasp every detail and nuance of what Zechariah is saying here doesn't make them any less true, and it doesn't make me any less faithful, for that matter, because there can be challenging narratives, particularly when it comes to these Old Testament prophecies. Going once? All right, jump to Malachi. Everybody go, whoo, right? It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier. It's kind of hard, too, because I really had hoped to finish all of that Sunday, and it just didn't quite get there, so that it could connect to all the things that we said about it on Sunday. So here comes the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. And God says, I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons, or jackals, I think some translations say, of the wilderness. So, basically, God makes a proclamation. What's He say? In verse, I've loved you. What's their response? Yeah, where is it? Really? How have you loved us, Lord? And you talk about whether arrogance, pride, whatever it is, but it's pretty brave and contemptuous for them to be able to speak in that manner. And who are they, by the way? These are the folks that just came out of, the captivity wasn't all that long ago. Okay? Captivity's not all that long ago. And we're kind of the end of God's narrative under the Old Testament system. And it didn't take them long, apparently, even after they've returned. Well, we can kind of see that already because in our earlier studies, because when they came back, they got busy doing what? Building their own houses and doing their own thing. And making sure their own pockets were filled with anything and everything they needed. And it took them 20 years, with about a 16-year hiatus, I think, but 20 years to get the temple done when they were satisfying their own personal needs and building their own homes and things. And so it didn't take them long when they come back into the Promised Land and come back into Jerusalem and they kind of become self-absorbed again. And by the time Malachi writes, they're not a whole lot different than those who had gone into captivity to begin with. And when we might say to ourselves, well, what's wrong with them? Why is this people continually benefited and blessed? They forsake the Lord. They're judged. They're punished. Brought back, benefited, blessed, forsook the Lord, judged. But it's this cycle that they never seem to get out of. But yeah. And though we might look disparagingly maybe a little bit at them, the truth is that God's people today have the same issues. Where people kind of come along and they serve and they're faithful and they try to be spiritually minded, but then the cares and concerns of the world kick in and we become distracted and we don't nearly stay as dedicated as we need to. And so that rise and fall of relationship with God has been around for a long time. And so their question, wherein hast thou loved us? And so what's he say? How's he answer that? Okay, but the question relates to what two individuals? Jacob and Esau. And he basically says, I loved and blessed Jacob and I hated Esau.
People need to watch that too because people say, oh, God doesn't hate.
Yeah. There it is. Yeah. And I'll even go one step further than that, Brian. I think we need to be careful too not to soften that word. You might say, well, he loved less. No, that's not really what he's saying here. He didn't say that he disregarded, he disregarded Esau in the blessings and purposes that he had. Jacob received the blessings. Jacob was chosen to be the specific person. And what God's doing here, and I think sometimes maybe we get caught up on the wrong side of this conversation. Who's he having conversation with? He's having a conversation with the Jacob side of this thing, right? Okay? And so he's talking to them. He's talking about the lineage that came from Jacob. And so he tells them, remember how I've blessed you and helped you and chose you over Esau. Look at the history of the Edomites and see the challenges and the misery and the difficulties that they had to experience. And they never had the kind of opportunities that the lineage of Jacob did. They never had the opportunities that God continually extended unto them to Jacob to be able to repent and show penitence and return back to God, and the blessings would be fulfilled again. God says, I can evidence real quick how I've loved you. Because you were a very special and peculiar people to me who had ample opportunities every time you stepped out of relationship with me to be able to repent and come back. Esau never had that. The Edomites never had that kind of blessing. Run to Romans chapter 9. I think this is right. I left my notes sitting on the desk, but I think I know this is right. Yeah. So in Romans chapter 9 and verse 13, notice what Paul does. He says, as it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? God forbid. Where he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it is not him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. God has a right to show mercy to whomever and to however He chooses. We don't have right to dictate to God, well, you need to be more merciful to this group, or you need to be more merciful to that group, or this action ought to be enough for you, God, to be merciful to this person or that person. It may sound blunt and direct, but it's Bible. God says, I get to decide whom and how people are going to receive my mercy. I get to choose that, God says. And what amazes me is that Paul here uses the same thing that Malachi uses in order to illustrate that. Jacob he loved. Esau he hated. He disregarded it when it came to how, who, and whom he was going to show mercy. Yeah. And yeah. Right. Right. That softens it too much. I think there needs to be this understanding of distinction of whom God has chosen and whom He did not, and it's within His sovereign right to do that as a Creator. And the beauty of that, of the end result of all this, though, is that by the time we get to Jesus, then who has access to His mercy? All people do, but according to God's will and purpose and plan. And so, though everybody has access, there's a manner in which by which He says to access that. In the days of Jacob, it meant being part of that family heritage in order to receive the benefits and blessings and mercy that God was extending. Under the new covenant in Jesus Christ, it meant belonging to Jesus in order to receive those mercies and blessings as well. Yeah. 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 And there were plenty of issues in that whole narrative. But lest we overly think that God is being too harsh towards Esau. In many senses, Esau chose this path himself by despising the birthright and being willing to forfeit it for really nothing at the end of the day. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and it's hard sometimes for us to kind of mesh together the idea that God has great plans and purposes that are going to be fulfilled without Him needing to change the will and heart of a man to do it. He didn't have to turn Esau. Esau turned himself. But it resulted in the fulfillment of what God had intended and purposed all along to bless Jacob in that process. So I know some of that can get jumbled in our minds, but that's a balance we have to appreciate as it comes to this.
Calvin took that to the future.
Yeah, yeah.
How we have free will, and yet God doesn't make us a bunch of robots to feel on my understanding.
Yeah.
But you get into all the predestination and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's the challenge people have. They want to think of predestination as all things chosen for you. We are predestined. We're predestined to be the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. But it's a choice, and it's a decision that we make to be. It's what God's purpose and will and predestined choice for us is. But He's not puppeteering anybody to make that decision. Go ahead, Ray. Yeah. We see all things in chronological timeline, but all things that will be have, in many senses, already happened in the eyes of God because of His omniscience. And so He uses this illustration here. If you've got any question, I kept blessing Jacob. I kept letting his people return to me and repent. I didn't offer that to anybody else. Whereas Edom, verse 4 saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts. They shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. Don't question whether I love you or not. Just look at how I've dealt and addressed with other people who, in many senses, by the way, had committed the same sins and behaviors. Now, that's kind of the interesting thing to kind of throw in there. It doesn't mean that Jacob was better. It doesn't mean that his heritage behaved any better than what the Edomites had and the lineage of Esau had. But God says, I loved you because I kept coming back to you and letting you change and letting you come back to me and continued to bless you and allowed you to stay part of this heritage that was going to bring the seed of Abraham into existence. And so there's lots of evidence, was what God is saying, that I've loved you. Yeah. And yeah. Yeah. And so they played the part well, but in some senses, God's saying, though, irregardless, it doesn't matter. In the sense that I have chose you to show mercy to, when I didn't show the same levels of mercy for the same kinds of things in the lives of other people. Now that all changes, because all of that is intended to keep one line pure until we get to Jesus. Once Jesus arrives, then everybody has the same access to mercy through the same will and purpose. But God says, in the meantime, I had to show you special favor and blessing despite your behaviors in order to keep you going while others didn't receive that same benefit.
Brian, in the first part of Malachi, is Malachi addressing the priests?
I think he will be. I think he's probably big picture for the moment, but I think there comes a point here where he starts directing his attention very specifically to the Levites and the priesthood. Yes. Especially when he starts talking about how they corrupted the sacrifices. And your eyes shall see, verse 5, and ye shall say, the Lord will be magnified from the board of Israel. A son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I be a father, where is my honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you. O priests, now he turns that attention, that despise my name. And ye say, wherein have we despised thy name? So he says, you call me Father, but if I was, you would do what? You'd honor me as a father. Malachi establishes a great principle for us here. You can't have it both ways. You and I can't presume the right to call upon God as our Father, but then not give Him the honor due as a Father. We don't get to kind of try to embrace the privileges that come by addressing Him as God, our Father, but then don't even make any attempt to honor Him as such. Servant understands who his master is and gives him fear. But their sinful behaviors had illustrated that they didn't have anyone. Didn't have any fear of God. That's a scary place to be, by the way, in life. To get to a point where we don't fear God anymore. To get to a point where we sin without hesitation or concern or thought to what God thinks about that. Without any kind of fearful respect for what God has done and can do and will do. And He's begging them here. He's urging them to realize, you can call me Father all day, but you don't give me honor. It's meaningless. You can say you're a servant to me as the master, but if you don't fear me enough to actually do what I'm asking of you and avoid the pitfalls that I've warned you against, then what kind of relationship is that? And then he gets personal. He says, "O priests that have despised my name," and then they'll say what? Well, how do we do that? Wherein have we despised thy name? Wherein did that happen? And God says, it happened when you offered polluted bread upon mine altar. And you say, wherein have we polluted thee? And that you say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. Have you ever felt like spiritual life is too hard? Now, I don't want you to answer that out loud, because I think all of us at times would probably say to ourselves, yeah, it's kind of hard sometimes. Works of the flesh are appealing. Things of this life have their appeal, their allure. And sometimes it's hard to do what's right in the face of circumstances and situations and people who would prefer me do something else. But they had gotten to such a point, and in a sense got so lazy in their relationship with God that they didn't want to quit offering the bread. But if it was a little moldy, and you can almost hear them. God's really doesn't really need that anyway, right? So if the bread's a little stale, so what? Well, it's going out and making it fresh like we should and doing it the right way, and preparing His table like it should be prepared. It's just too much work. It's contemptible. If you offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? When they went out to find that which they were going to sacrifice, what were they to find? What kind of animal should they be sacrificing unto God? Yeah, perfect, without blemish. And if you got a male one in the flock, you better bring that. We'll see that later in the narrative. He says, don't come to God with a blind sacrifice. I don't mean you personally, but the animal you're bringing to sacrifice, and expect God to appreciate that. If you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. You know, get you a big box. Stamp that to the IRS and go find the weakest, sickliest animal you can find out here somewhere and put it there and send that off to him to pay your taxes. See what happens. That's the idea here. You wouldn't dare offend the governor with a blind or a sick or a lame offering to pay your dues and tribute unto the governor. You wouldn't even fathom doing that. But you'll give it to God every time you walk to the altar. You'll offer that before the Lord as if it's a sacrifice when it's nothing but a lame, sick, blind animal that you were probably going to dispose of anyway. Because who wants to continue the problem of blind and weak and sickly animals among the herds and flocks? God says that's how you've dishonored my name. Will He be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? Now I pray you, beseech God that He will be gracious unto us. This hath been by your means. Will He regard your persons, saith the Lord of hosts. He says, you better get this figured out. And you better think this through a little more. And you better hope that the Lord is willing to be gracious and give you the kind of mercy and space and time you need to turn and change these things. Because this is unacceptable. You can't keep coming to the Lord with sacrifices that don't cost you anything. And you've heard me say this before. The greatest example to me of that is what David did. And you recall when David comes to King Ornan and he wants to make a sacrifice unto God there. And basically King Ornan says, what? You can have whatever you need. I'll just give it to you. Whatever you need. And David says, I will not offer unto the Lord that which cost me nothing. I'm not doing it. He bought the utensils, the things necessary to build the altar. He bought that particular parcel of ground exactly in that space. And then he bought the larger parcel of ground that was around it. And that would be his sacrifice before the Lord. He would not offer something that cost him nothing. And so, go ahead, Rain. I'm sorry. Yeah, and that's important for us to recognize through all this. And so they had some very specific connotation, right? They were offering real animals upon real altars. Who's the sacrifice now, according to Romans 12? We are, right? Present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable or spiritual service. In Romans 12, 1 and 2. We're the sacrifice now. So don't bring God in our weakest, most futile, feeble efforts. He deserves the best of us, the first fruits from our lives. He deserves the top levels of our energies and life. And that's what He's seeking from all of us. Yeah. And there can even be some connection. Sure. And you see that same picture in our offering specifically about how we do that in a sacrificial manner and making a conscious decision about how that sacrifice works rather than being told exactly what to give. Whereas theirs was much slightly different. Go ahead, Brian. Yeah. Yeah. And then he continues, who is there even among you that would shut the doors for naught? I think, by the way, Gary, I think he's probably still talking to the priest here under your comment earlier. But who is there even among you that these priests who would not even shut a door for naught? I'll give you a quick illustration of this. I don't know the name, so I can tell you the story without worrying about implicating anybody. But I remember I was in Moundsville and there was a funeral director telling me this account. But basically, a fella had been scheduled to conduct a service. He wasn't really connected all that much to the family. Just one person in that family knew him, had invited him to be the speaker for this service. He got busy, I guess. I don't know. Was 10 minutes late. Called the funeral director and said, sorry, I'm late. I'll be there. Ask him to wait another 20 minutes. I'm on my way. And he said, don't worry about it. Don't even come. We've already got a substitute. And he came anyway. Here's the part I'll shorten the story for. There's more to it, but I'll shorten it. After the service was conducted by somebody else, this preacher walked into the funeral director's office and went like this. He wanted the honorarium from the service. And he was told, you didn't conduct the service. He said, I came. That's all that matters. Apparently he won't even show up without Right? He's the picture. I thought of this narrative. As soon as I heard that story, I thought of this narrative. He won't even show up. Even when he's been told, don't bother, he won't even show up without being paid. Even in a circumstance like that. That's the way these priests have become. Open a door. Check, please. They wouldn't do anything for naught. Neither do you kindle fire on mine altar for naught. Personalize. I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts. Neither will I accept an offering at your hand. I don't have any pleasure in the way you're acting and conducting yourselves, and I don't accept any offering that you bring from your hands. For from the rising of the sun even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. And in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering. For my name shall be great among the heathen, saith the Lord of hosts. I think he's talking about, obviously, when Jesus arrives, that even the heathen will have a better offering before the Lord than you all have. Even the heathen nations who hadn't been given access before, when they finally gain access, they're going to be offering unto the Lord things that God will accept and are beneficial and that are heartfelt and that faith is motivating. And not just out of pattern or rote or offering weak and sickly things. You've profaned it, and that you say the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. You've profaned it. You've made it vain. You've tried to argue, well, what's the reason to bring in these fruit and grain offerings, and what's the reason for all these animal sacrifices and all these things? You chose to make the table of the Lord contemptible. And you're the ones who said also, behold, what a weariness it is. Yeah. Yeah. They had forgotten what it was, and I think we'll see that in the continuing narrative here, but they had forgotten what a privilege it was to be part of the Levitical priesthood. They were a chosen people among chosen people for special purpose, and here they are, the ones who should have had the greater connection to God and had this tremendously important role of when the people came to them to offer the right kinds of sacrifices and use the altar of God in the right ways and beseech Him for the things that were necessary. And they're the ones that say, oh, this is so hard. Oh, what a weariness it is. And you've snuffed at it, saith the Lord of hosts. You know, when we grow tired and weary of serving the Lord, we have a problem. God hasn't changed. God's character hasn't changed. He's the same as He's always been, asking of us the same thing. We're the ones that are challenged. We're the ones that need to reevaluate and rethink things. You know, and I try not to get on too much of a soapbox here or a pulpit, but we've really tried in a lot of ways to create ways of serving the Lord that are simplified. And we've done a lot of things. We heat our buildings. We make them air conditioned in the summer. We pad the pews. We try to be reasonable in length of sermons. We try to be reasonable in how we construct worship so that it fulfills the purposes of God. And yet, people still say, oh, what a weariness it is. I can't fathom, and I know I'm talking to the wrong audience. You're here on a Wednesday night. I'm talking to the wrong audience. But But I can't grasp how 4 hours, roughly, a week, 4 to 4.5 hours a week is a weariness. Most people Netflix more than that. Right? You know, you're binge watching some show from the 80s for more than 4.5 hours a week. And this is a weariness. There are reasons. There are legit reasons. I don't believe forsaking the assembling of yourselves together means that you missed one service and the hammer's coming down. I don't believe that text means that. There's a pattern involved with Hebrews 10:25 that people are breaching. Don't forsake the assembling. It's a continuity of thought. But yet, I challenge us to encourage as many others as we can to appreciate every opportunity to serve and to worship God and to never let it become weary. How can worship to God ever become wearisome? Unless I've changed my disposition about God. Or maybe worship has become to me something other than about God. Maybe the challenge is I've become weary with people. I don't like the people that worship, and so therefore I don't worship. Or I've become weary with the style, or I become weary with the process. But if that's the case, then my emphasis is in all the wrong places. If that's the case, I've forgotten that worship never was about the people or the process. It's always been about God. It's always been about God. So challenge yourself, and let's challenge others to never find this mindset as being acceptable, where we think that it's a weariness to do what God's asked of us, and we just snuff at it. It'll be all right. You brought that which was torn, lame, sick. Thus you brought an offering. Should I accept this of your hand, saith the Lord? You tell me. I like that kind of question. You tell me. Puts them on the spot, right? You tell me. Should I accept that or not? Is that really okay or not? Would you accept it as payment? Would the governor accept it as payment? Would we accept lackluster service? You go to a restaurant, don't you tip a little more when you feel like somebody went above and beyond and out of their way to take care of you? To kind of make you a priority to them and their service? I do. I tend to tip more. I didn't say I don't tip at all if it's bad, because some people can be having a bad day like anybody else. But I always tip a little more when I feel like somebody went above and beyond, went out of their way. My point simply is this. God says, go out of your way. This isn't a weariness. Go above and beyond. It's the Lord, after all, that you're worshiping and honoring. It's God that we're serving. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. We are now His royal priesthood. Go ahead, Brian.
Galatians 6:9-10. Paul says, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially to them who are uncomfortable."
Yeah. And so the concept hasn't changed. All right. There's your spot, Randy, for Sunday. Randy's going to cover. I'm going to be going for 4 days next week. I'll be in Columbus speaking over there at Laurel Canyon Sunday through Wednesday. And so Randy's got Bible study Sunday morning. Bill's going to preach Sunday morning.